My name is Alana, and I use they, them pronouns.
And my name is Jessie. I use she, her pronouns.
And we're making menches.
Making Menches is your home for queer, anti-Zionist Jewish ritual, radical education, and community.
Hi, everyone. Today we are talking to Julie Weitz. Julie is a diasporic performance artist, Fulbright scholar, and co-creator of the Tzitzit Project. Some of you may know her as My Golem is Here on Instagram. First and foremost, Julie, could you share with our listeners what a golem is?
Sure, what a golem is. Well, in mystical tradition, a golem is known to be a clay figure that the mystics would form into being and either write the word emet, which means truth in Hebrew, on its forehead, or put a piece of paper, emet, in its mouth, and then it would be like breathing life into this creature. And the creature is understood to be like a humanoid or like an avatar. And over time, the creature gains consciousness. So originally, the golem sort of directed, in a lot of the folklore, the golem's directed to seek justice, usually in the context of the Jews are persecuted in Eastern Europe and they need like a helper. But often in the stories, there's this lesson where the creator loses control over its creation. And then there's this process of really de-animating the golem and removing the aleph, so it returns to like a still de-animated state. So I got really interested in it years ago. I mean, it already feels like such an old project now that I'm engaging with the Dybbuk. But I really found I was always fascinated with the folklore, and the project originated basically after the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. And, you know, it was the start of Trump's presidency and just being so confused, angry, and wanting to develop a response. And I started making these silly Instagram videos of the golem, me performing as a golem seeking revenge on the white supremacists. And it kind of took off from there. And what was cool is, like, as an artist, I engaged with the mythology, like, okay, I'm going to let this come into being however it's called to. And so people would be like inviting me to develop it more in such and such ways. And I let it just like grow out of my control. And it was a really liberating way to approach creation as an artist, because it really took me to places that I couldn't predetermine. And also it was embodied and it was collaborative, and that kind of set me off on a new path for my art practice and helped me dive deeper into like Yiddish culture and Yiddish folklore.
Thank you for giving that background. I feel like I'm so fascinated by the idea of the golem and like all of the oral history and tradition surrounding it. I feel like I've been following your work personally for a really long time on social media and just been like very interested in all of the different kinds of work that you do. What should our listeners know about you? Like, in a few minutes, what would you tell someone who is interested in the work that you do? And could you highlight some of the projects you've worked on?
I tell people that I make performance art inspired by Yiddish folklore. It's site specific, and for a year I lived in Poland and created a whole project around the Dybbuk, which is a wandering spirit that possesses a living body. And so I really began to play with that folklore in thinking about how we relate to ancestors and how there are entities within us that have a kind of attachment to us that are, I sort of think of them as like ancestral grief. let's say, or the presence of ancestors in some way that are kind of trying to relay messages to us, and how do we encounter them? Now, this sounds like sort of a spiritual way of engaging, but I definitely think about it creatively. And there's this amazing history of the Dybbuk being performed in Poland and really internationally by Yiddish-speaking theater troupes. And the most famous Yiddish film, Der Dybbuk. So this was really inspiring to me because another aspect of the work is like engaging with Yiddish folklore also means engaging with a past that has been mostly lost. And what does it mean to like reclaim these stories, these methods of encounter with places, with language, with song, with dance, with costume, and sort of beyond my expectation, the work keeps expanding because I realize that, especially in this moment, it feels like the work is in service to the unprocessed grief and fear and a whole body of emotions that I think, like, in general, and I can only speak from my lineage as an Ashkenazi Jew, we haven't quite channeled. And I find in the performance of the Dybbuk, which I have designed this performance in collaboration with non-Jewish Poles, where we perform a ritual exorcism of the Dybbuk. And the Dybbuk is something that's transmutable. Like it originates in me in the performance, but then it kind of moves through the space, through the other performers, and we perform it at sites of Jewish memory. So the first site we performed it as was a former concentration camp outside of Krakow. And what I have found I was on this Fulbright in Poland, and I just found that there, like, especially I arrived in September, and then October 7th happened. And that really put me into like a new awareness and deep questioning of why I was there, because the other aspect of this work is really rooting in diaspora and Doikite. And it's been really amazing to see the way that Doikite has completely kind of risen up into consciousness during this really challenging period. And I think I wanted to really understand, okay, Doikite and these ideas of diaspora and Zionism and anti-Zionism emerged from Poland. A lot of those early iterations of these ideas were based in Polish lands. And then of course, like being there, you're living in the genocide of the Shoah and consciousness of like the eradication of so much Jewish life. And in that, there's holding so much grief and pain, and also there's like these ways to engage with what was that is also about bringing joy and light. And also like creating an opening for how to reimagine what the Dybbuk is, because just to say there's like so many iterations of the Dybbuk story. And even in Poland, amongst non-Jewish communities, it's like a thing. A lot of artists and playwrights deal with the Dybbuk, and they even think of the Dybbuk as haunting Poland as this spirit of Jewish memory. And I'm beginning to understand more and more that this process of inviting people in to like engage with the presence of ancestors, the presence of grief in some kind of ancestral and collective way is also a way of like activating us somatically and through our imaginations of how do we deal with this moment. I think I'm just really orienting towards this, how do we hold each other in embodied creative ways?
I'm so glad to talk about the Dybbuk because this is one Jewish concept that I feel is very in the spirit of like where we got started with our podcast, which is like something that did not get talked about as in my Hebrew school experience or in my synagogue experience at all. I'm reflecting now that like I think my synagogue was a pretty like Americanized or like we're very assimilated type experience of Reform Judaism, where it was like we don't really do all the like Yiddish stuff. Like we'd, use Yiddish terminology and stuff occasionally, but exploring the Dybbuk as like a manifestation of Jewish fear or like trauma or memory. I remember seeing the Dybbuk depicted in A Serious Man, which of course is a lot of people's, I think, like touch point for the Dybbuk. And that kind of bizarre story that starts off the whole movie. And so this is my long-winded way of bringing us through this question that you have about kind of the haunting experience of Judaism in Poland, the memory of Judaism in Poland. And my question is, our podcast is very American Jewish based. And I'm curious if you feel that American Judaism is as haunted by our trauma and our fear, or if it's really more of a Ashkenazi, Polish, Holocaust-based experience abroad.
We'll see how this answer unfolds. The first thing that I thought of is that I think there's a aspect of American Judaism that's very blocked. Like it just doesn't have access to like histories and memories that's connected to lineage. And I think assimilation, white supremacy, capitalism really takes these spirits away from us. And it's hard to acknowledge that because it requires a real inner reflection. And I know for me in my own process, it required me to examine my own internalized anti-Semitism because I was actually ashamed of certain aspects that I identified as very Jewish about my family, for example. There was always a lot of Yiddishkeit in my family, but I was embarrassed by it for so long. And when I came into the Golem performance, I had no real training as a performer, but what I realized is that actually this was very much in me through my family, that I grew up in a very big Jewish family in Chicago, and the family had a tradition for 3 generations of performing for each other, of doing talent shows. And it was also very queer. Like my grandparents' generation dressing up in drag. And there was like a striptease that one uncle did, and like all of this like total Yiddishkeit performance. And when I started to learn about what that lineage is, from Yiddish performance to vaudeville and the amateur version that manifests in my family, and mind you, I do have one famous performer in my family, which your generation will not know this reference, but there's a Wendy's commercial where an old Jewish lady says, "Where's the beef?" That's my great aunt, Aunt Clara. Yeah, so like it's the most Yiddishkeit thing. She says like, "Where's the beef?" Anyhow, I was like, I had to like really come to understand that this was like such a cool connection to have. And that actually empowered me to go deeper. Back to your question around like American Judaism, like I'm really interested in bringing Ashkenazi Jews from North America to Poland to like re-examine the way that we engage with the memory of these lands. And for example, a lot of people will say, okay, I'm an Ashkenazi Jew, and you ask them where they're from, they can't really get the lineage, Russia, I don't know, like it's only 3 or 4 generations ago. Like, let's examine that history, especially because it was like 1,000 years that your family was probably from those lands. And yet there's this dissonance because people have been to Israel many times, but they've never been to Warsaw where their grandmother's from. And there's a reason why. There's many reasons why. So I want to honor, like, people really see Poland as a death site. And I understand that. And I also think that narrative is reinforced for specific reasons. And obviously it's tied to Zionism. And like, there's so much healing potential. This is what I really believe, to like go to these lands, to be in the forests and to reconnect with these vibrant histories of resistance, of innovation, of poetry, song, dance. And I think it's available to us, there's nothing that's holding us from going there except our own fear and our own misunderstandings of what this place was. And granted, all of this is connected to, it's like my great-grandparents came from these lands. It's the old country, and they're having to like assimilate into whiteness. And the first American generation born here is able to do that. And now I think like in this moment in time where we're obviously a lot of Jews who are white are in America are like examining their identities in different ways. And I think a lot of different groups are doing this kind of ancestry work. So I'm holding that opportunity for us to go to these lands. And I think, books like Ashkenazi Herbalism, it's like this incredible index that they're, pulling from these lineages that we have and different. I know there's so many people doing incredible work to like bring back these traditions. So somehow I'm engaging with it through the folklore and through a kind of creative process.
I just want to say, I think that that's so, that idea of like bringing us back to actual lineages of like the actual places that we're coming from, whether that be through like herbalism or folklore, which by the way, I love Ashkenazi herbalism, like, but books like that and like the work that you're doing, I feel like was really impactful for me in my journey towards like the unlearning of a lot of the Zionist propaganda that I was like brought up with, and being like, oh no, actually like my connections are to this completely different place. Like my connections are not to Israel. I don't have family there. Like that's not where I'm from. That's not where generations of my family are from. But generations of my family are from Poland and Russia, and like getting to actually explore that in more depth allowed me to connect to my Judaism more in ways that Zionism like never really allowed me to connect to my Judaism and my ancestors, which like ancestors are such a deep and beautiful part of Jewish spirituality, but it feels very hard to connect to them when we're not actually talking about where they're from. So yeah, I just wanted to uplift that. I think that that work is really important and transformative for a lot of Jews on their like journey of unlearning.
Absolutely. And like that last part, hearing you say it, like grief comes up for me because it's like there's also a process of acknowledging and examining like why those ancestors have been cut off from us. And I've been studying Yiddish. I'm only a beginner still, but like I constantly have this feeling like this language is in me. Like, how am I not able to fully speak it fluently yet? And, it's it's a little bit of like a joke with myself because there's also like this question of like, am I romanticizing this thing? Am I desiring something that is, I don't know, some sort of just creative fetish? But I know from the Yiddishists and people I'm around who speak Yiddish, there's really like through the language, you're connecting to this deep thing and it goes for 1,000 years. Like, and this is part of, look, the Zionist project, like modernized Hebrew. It's only like, I don't know, 150 years old. It's like, it was Loshen Kodesh. You wouldn't speak it in colloquially. And yeah, something I've been thinking a lot about, trying to feel into is like, what does it really mean to be exalted in the diaspora, to really feel into the beauty of what diaspora holds? And I hear it through music, I hear it through culture, through song, dance, like this way in which Jews have been spread across the globe and integrate aspects of their local culture and then kind of create it for themselves, and also in collaboration with their neighbors. Now I'm giving like the nicer, smoother, flowier version of it. Like obviously in all these different instances across the globe, like Jews have also faced persecution and been challenged. But I really am coming to understand more and more that the natural occurrence or the kind of organic occurrence of like cultures moving and acculturating and sharing is a, a way of being beyond borders, a way of existing and engaging that is not about identifying enemies and creating defenses. And that really was the diaspora for 2,000 years. And it's only in, 150 years, not even, that there's this formation of nation state identity that is really trying to kill the notion of diaspora. Maybe kill is too strong of a word, because there's also obviously like the reinvention of culture. But as much as diaspora is being used now in a kind of politicized way to like really state your non-Zionist or anti-Zionist position, it is, I think, a question I've had is like, but what does it really mean to like engage with diasporic culture? And how do we make culture that's like not outside of politics or beyond politics, but allows the heart of what it means to be diasporic to come through in deep ways?
This is amazing. Tisha B'Av this summer, I was at an anti-Zionist gathering, and Ami Weintraub, who's a rabbinical student at RRC, I want to give him this credit for sharing this because it's not my own idea at all, but spoke about the idea of Doikite being like a very specific translation of here-ness. And we apply it to mean a lot of different things now. Like we're like, we are at home here in Brooklyn, in New York, or like we are at home wherever. But the concept of Doikite was like originated to be about Eastern Europe and like reclaiming a here-ness in everything you're talking about, in this like mess of nation state, of ethnic domination, of all of these different versions of empire that were being imposed upon people. And so while it is great that we can apply it to many different contexts, like understanding really what Doikite meant to the people who originated it is something that is really empowering and important to remember. And so I think there are like abstract concepts that can originate out of what we're talking about here, but I think like understanding the terminology and where they came from and why it was empowering to our ancestors helps root us in the larger abstract concepts that develop from it, if that makes sense. So that's why I'm loving this like discussion about it. It's just like enriching my concept of all of this. But so
Yeah, totally. And like what it means to us today. And I mean, I think one challenge of dealing with the historical context of Doikite is that it didn't work. It didn't protect the Jews. And I'm developing this new project that's based in Poland, and it's about this Rabbi Aaron Shmuel Tamaras, who was writing liberation theology in the early 20th century. And he was an early Zionist, and he left the movement because he basically saw that it was about power and domination. And he wrote about nonviolence through a Jewish lens, and he was an anti-nationalist. And he had these two tracks of writing. One was like liberation theology, like really thinking about freedom from a theological perspective. And the other was political critique. And in fact, he used a pseudonym because he didn't want to be identified. And his pseudonym was One of the Sensitive Rabbis, which I love. And he also had this like deep relationship to the trees, and he was from a small town in Eastern Europe, in Eastern Poland along the Belarusian border, which is known for these like vast primeval forests. And I am starting a project there because the town where he's from, which was 60% Jewish, and the synagogue was in the center of town, the synagogue has recently been renovated. And there's this incredible phenomenon across Poland where there's individual, what they're called Jewish memory workers or Jewish memory activists. And they're not Jewish, they're Polish, and they're basically doing the preservation of Jewish life in these villages, wherever they're from. And they're like, my encounter with these individuals is just incredible. They just are bringing like so much sensitivity and awareness. So I'm collaborating with one of my collaborators is the woman who got the EU grants to renovate the synagogue, and the synagogue is empty. And I feel like it is just calling us to activate that space. Here is this prophetic voice who's talking about nonviolence from a Jewish perspective. I mean, it's unnerving to read his texts from like 1905 because he is outlining all of the violence that's going to come from the Zionist project. He sees it through and through, and yet He dies in 1931. All of his family is killed in the Shoah, except the ones who immigrated to Palestine. So there's complexity there, right? And this is also like, I don't have a clear answer for what this means. What I know is that there's something very powerful to go back to these lands, to be in these forests, to go to these synagogues, and to fill that space with Jewish life and Jewish questioning, and to like read his texts and ground ourselves in the study and understanding. And this is where I see Poland as being really integral to all of these questions. And there's a political element too, because, you know, it's a requirement for Israeli high school students to go to Poland and go on these death camp tours. And I witnessed a lot of it. And it's right before they're preparing to go to the army. So it's really like engineered, right? To like sit in the victimhood and the violence. Mind you, only half of the students are of Ashkenazi descent. So you're also building this narrative within. And I think there's so many other ways to engage with Jewish memory and Jewish loss. And really memory culture is like more and more something that I'm sitting with, because the way that the Shoah has been weaponized and constantly justified for just obscene violence. Yeah, so I feel that there's a lot of lessons waiting for us to sift through.
Yeah, what a powerful project. I didn't know that students in Israel were like required to go on this trip to Poland, like especially pre their IOF service. And it's so interesting because I actually went on a trip very much like that when I was in high school. It was called like Lador Vador, and it basically sent a bunch of like high school aged kids, I think I was 15, to Prague and Poland for a week. And we went to like Auschwitz-Birkenau, to Raisin, like all of these different concentration camps, and like, yeah, all of these places where like Jewish life was destroyed theoretically and literally. And then we spent a month in Israel, literally being like, and look, like all of this death happened of all of your ancestors. And now look at this place where Jewish life is so vibrant and Jewish people are so alive. And that like really cemented me in Zionism for years to come. Before that, I think I was very like passive. It's kind of like, yeah, like my family is Zionist, so that's what I believe. That's what my community says, that I'm not questioning it. But then that I feel like made me a very active participant in it. Like I felt a lot of deep love and care for Israel and felt very connected to it. And I think I would have unlearned much sooner than I did if I hadn't gone on that trip and like been through that propaganda in the way that I was, because it's like it's so insidiously smart, like it's so intentional, and it is really powerful. Like as a young person whose brain is not nearly fully developed to like walk through a concentration camp and like bear witness to that level of destruction, and then be shown like Israel in this very positive Jewish light, was, yeah, just incredibly detrimental to my young brain. And I'm glad that I got to where I am now, but it's a tool that is weaponized like often in that propaganda work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's hard because like Israel isn't the promise of what it was imagined to be. We can't believe in this fairy tale anymore. And that's the disillusionment, right? And also, it's such a disservice to the memory of all of these lives lost that the only way we can see into the future is through the nation state. Like, what if actually we're bringing forth the memory of their writing, the memory of their song, the memory of their daily life, and not just going to sites of death, but actually sites of culture making, And even if those sites were destroyed, like being in those spaces and the forests and not bypassing the grief through nationalism. And I think that's, for me, I know that's a lot of the double grief that I'm carrying with what's happening in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, and in Israel. Because also, like, I mean, everyone's suffering. And even seeing now, I'm based in Berlin and seeing what's happening in Germany. I don't know how aware of that you might be, but in Germany, there's an acceleration of police violence since October 7th and all of the censorship. And there's a large Palestinian population there, and there's threats of deportation. And I've seen the police brutality. It's out of control. And when you see it done by German police, it's like so present that they're reenacting the behavior that they perpetrated upon the Jews and to the Muslim and Arab Germans living there. And they're just completely blind to it. And I guess the reason I bring this up is I'm just thinking, like, again, Germany thought it could bypass its guilt by putting all of its promise in Israel, and like their reparations, their reason of state is to support Israel. And it's like nothing's learned. If you're just reenacting this behavior onto another marginalized group, reorienting our like Ashkenazi relationship to Shoah in order to also understand the life that was. Like, I just think there's so much the engagement with the death. And then, of course, the way it's weaponized. I want to tell a brief story that I heard someone point out. It was an academic who was studying the history of anti-Semitism in Poland. And, you know, there's a lot of people today who think Poland is all anti-Semitic. And I certainly know that anti-Semitism still exists there. But also my personal encounter was not that case. And the relationships that I built in Poland, it's really quite beautiful because actually Poland was the biggest Jewish population before the war. 1 in 10 Poles was Jewish. Like, that's a crazy amount for such a small population of Jews. Jewish culture is like embedded in aspects of Polish culture. And this historian was saying, you know, there were good moments and bad moments, but like Jews did pretty well considering in Poland for a long time. And he pointed out that the last scene in Schindler's List, do you remember what that scene is?
It's been a while since I've watched.
Yeah, the last scene is they're at the graves of the righteous ancestor or righteous Gentiles in Israel. And he was saying, this historian, and I can't remember his name offhand, he was saying, like, the majority of the Jews in Poland who died in the Shoah, like, they didn't want to go to Palestine. Like, they wanted to be in their lands where their ancestors had lived for generations. And I think that's part of like what I'm saying is like to your experience of like, you go to Poland, you see the death sites, and then you're off to Israel, and like that's framed as your homeland. Like, it's just bypassing so much wisdom that is like embedded in who we are and how we came to be. And it's not easy history to engage with, like, there's no question. But I think there's a responsibility also to understand that history because it's also part of what's causing all the violence.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's, yeah, just a really important addition to that conversation. I feel like in many ways we've touched on this throughout our whole conversation so far, but before we sort of shift directions drastically, maybe not drastically, I want to see if there's anything you want to add to how the idea of like how your work might be informed by anti-Zionism, if at all. I feel like you've touched on a lot of different ways that it's informed by like diasporism largely, but wanted to give space.
Yeah, thank you for that. I really wouldn't say that my work's informed by anti-Zionism. I think that part of what it means to engage with Yiddish culture is a kind of reclaiming and revitalization that doesn't care about Zionism. Like Zionism is just like one more thing in the picture. Obviously, like in this moment, even more so. I mean, for me, there's always been an undercurrent of understanding that this is a response against Zionism. And I also don't think like it's in political theory that like the situation's going to be resolved. So I think that my engagement with healing practices and thinking about how my work can expand to actually function in some kind of healing modality or bring more consciousness to some of the questions we've been speaking to, or even reorienting the way that North American Jews travel through Poland and engage with that memories, rethinking how what does it mean to memorialize the Holocaust at this point in time? And how do we approach it in an intersectional way and in a way that does not support future genocides, present and future genocides? So at this point in time, I do think it's important to say, and it's complicated, but sometimes I feel like in North America, we get caught in the Zionism, anti-Zionism theoretical debates. And a bigger question that I absolutely don't have answers for is like, how do we create a state of coexistence? And what is the healing work that's going to happen for generations to actually allow people to live together in these lands? And I think like, that's just a deeper, harder question. I don't think I understand that that's not my role to answer, but I do feel like it's a conversation to be orienting around because we can get lost in the polarization. And something I appreciate about what I hear from what you are doing on your podcast is expanding the conversation so that we can have differing opinions in the plurality of what Jewish life is. I mean, this polarization and fracturing within Jewish community is ridiculous. And not only is it ridiculous, it's just so harmful. And this kind of positioning, which I know is coming from these very Zionist entities. I mean, at this point in time, something that's really challenging is that like, if I'm vocal about these points of view, like there are just a number of organizations that will just like cut me out of the picture. Like that doesn't make sense at all. Like this is something, a plurality of points of view that I look to Poland for. So, pre-war, I mean, there were so many different youth organizations that were Zionist, anti-Zionist, Bundist, like territorialists, like there were all these different, it was like a whole plethora of arguments around like what the future holds for Jews, but they were active and they were engaged. And this kind of squashing of Jewish voices and opinions, obviously there's a lot at stake. And there's a lot of people with power and money but to me, it's like they're holding on with so much fear. And that's just evidence of like how depleted, spiritually deprived they are. I really feel that. And like, that's not where real culture is going to come from. And that's why I speak to this like celebration of culture in the diaspora and what does it mean to make diasporic culture and be a part of that movement. And this is something on a positive note, if there's any positive impact to what's happening right now, is the engagement in Jewish life, at least in North America, is at this other level. And while it's very much oriented around politics, as it should be, as people should be speaking out and embodying forms of protest in the ways that they're doing, I think also what it's doing is it's collectivizing and it's bringing forth voices and it's being able to share our stories with each other in order to like break down and dismantle these systems of violence and domination.
I'm going to shift us a little bit, but I think all of your work is under this umbrella of like connecting diasporism, Judaism, queerness, like all of these things are running together. And when I was looking through some of your work, one of your pieces that stood out to us was The Great Dominatrix. This resonated for me and for us just because I think like the intersections of sex and Judaism and like queerness are so relevant to our lives and work that like we definitely engage with. We recently had hosted a panel that was highlighting queer anti-Zionist Jewish sex workers and the ways that like their work is entwined in liberation. Can you speak more to like these broader themes, also to that project? I thought it was fascinating. I hope people take a look.
Sure. The Great Dominatrix. That was a really fun video to make and a performance to do. I did do it live a few times. Yeah, well, that came out with the rise of Trump's presidency. And I was thinking about Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator. And he made that film in 1939, like while the war was going on. And for those listeners who don't know the film, he performs two roles in that film. One is as Hitler and the other as like a Jewish barber. And it's like the rise of fascism, and he's playing this character. And there's so many beautiful sequences, including this very strange sequence where he's performing as Hitler and he's holding a globe and he does this really beautiful dance with a globe. And at the same time that was happening, I was also having my own journey with BDSM and really thinking about like the aspects of Hasidic culture that have these like sexual components, which there are many, but I was really fascinated, like, what does it mean to be bound? And then also this whole riff of like Jewish global domination, and the golem is performing as a dominatrix and she's trying to dom a 3-foot inflatable globe. So just bringing like, inspired by Chaplin, like utter absurdity, a lot of clownishness. How do you transgress gender-wise, sexually within Jewish culture? There's lots of examples of this. I think one part of Jewish culture that I love is that transgression, sexual transgression, I think shows up in so many ways. I mean, I took a class on BDSM and Yiddish poetry. It was like amazing because I think there is this like history of like the binding and kind of like tensions of power. And also I'm obviously like embracing satire and comedy in that work. And I think there's also, when I was in Poland, I spent a lot of time in Hasidic communities. And for me, it's like, obviously I'm female presenting, like I don't have access to, there's always like a wall, right? There's a mechitza that's separating me. And I had to kind of work through my own frustration that I wanted access to this culture and that it was going to be limited. And I had to accept those terms if I was going to engage in those places. And I did. But I think when I was making The Great Dominatrix, I was still like frustrated that I couldn't. So I had to like perform it through this kind of drag character. And now I've reversed it. And I haven't really publicized this character too much, but I've done a performance. It's called The Psychedelic Sadiq. And I dress in as a drag king, like wearing a beard. And I eventually strip, I take off my bit cachet, and then I have like a Sephiroth harness on, and it gets a little sexy. So I guess that's my way of fully embodying the Hasidic man that I cannot be.
I'm obsessed with the idea of a Sephiroth harness. I'm gonna need to look into that. Yeah, thank you. It's actually some of the things you mentioned, I'm like, I wish that we had this source for our panel, because a lot of people had a lot of questions. Like, I think people are really curious to understand these intersections and like feel validated in the ways that like they embody those intersections already. But like, what is like the spiritual or historical like reference points for these things? And some of those things we were able to talk about. We had some wonderful panel members with a lot of like like Yiddish related background and history that they were bringing into the conversation that was really fascinating. But I do think so much has been lost and like isn't, because it's taboo for whatever reason, we've made it taboo. We don't talk about these things in like Hebrew school or with our families. And so then it's like, where does it live? Especially if we're not then going on to like be deeply entrenched in this work.
Well, and that is such a good transition because we also wanted to talk to you about Seat Project. And what I think is like the through line here is that there are parts of our tradition that we can see ourselves in very clearly. Like we're like, oh, there's this history and this connection to BDSM, and like it's always been there, and there's this queerness inherently. And then there are parts of our tradition that feel very closed off to us and that don't always feel accessible. And whether it's level of Jewish content knowledge or whether it's like familial practice or just preconceived notions about what belongs to who in Jewish culture, I think tzitzit is sometimes inaccessible to people just for all of those reasons, but because it's just not talked about a lot outside of certain communities. And so I love the Tzitzit Project, but I would love for you to share a little bit with us about what the project has been like for you.
Yeah, that's been a beautiful project with my collaborator, Jill Spector, who I worked with for many years on my costume designs for the Golem. And then what happened is I had this one performance where we created a large, like, tzitzit talit katan, and I ended up using the talit katan in the video in a way that really like brought a kind of spiritual quality that I hadn't expected. So the garment itself like inspired a performative act that became kind of the center point of the narrative arc of this project. And I started thinking more about what it would mean to wear tzitzit. And then I was thinking, well, I would want my tzitzit to be sexy. I want it to be silky. I want to feel good in it. What would that mean? And I started talking to Jill about it. And the beautiful aspect of our collaboration is we just start bouncing off ideas and we get so excited. And then we start doing research and asking questions. And soon enough, we found like there were other projects trying to like DIY tzitzit, but nothing was like from scratch and nothing aesthetically like fit the bill of like what we were thinking about. And then we also heard like, I heard an interview with Ezra Furman on a podcast that was all about tzitzit. And Ezra talks about like imagining kind of a sexy tzitzit, one that maybe had a bra as a part of it. And through all of this research, and then we started opening up conversations. So that was the other aspect. We were like, let's just make this super collaborative. And we started reaching out to queer, trans, feminist Jews of different generations, finding out if they wear tzitzit, what they would want from tzitzit, what kind of practical issues that they had, what in ways that it like gave them a sense of transcendence in their daily life, some sort of spiritual connection. And that's how we started our designs. So the whole process that we set out for ourselves was like, okay, we've been doing this, performative artistic project that like exists in the forms of like museum shows and gallery shows, but what does it mean to like create a project that's just all about serving community? And I had never done that before full on. And then also it was like, okay, this is a business. So this is the challenge, is to make it sustainable. We've hardly ever paid ourselves. We're so grateful that the way we got started was through a fundraiser. People just trusted us, and we've been able to deliver tzitzit to, I don't even know how many tzitzit we've made. I think at least like 200, if not more, 300. And like, we don't have any like investors. We haven't been able to get any grant money. And the past year, while I've been in Poland, Jill and our collaborator Hannah have really taken it on. And it's this issue of like unpaid labor. And I'm just naming that because if there happens to be a listener who wants to support this project, like we really would love to carry it on, but it's like we're just making ends meet. And yeah, we wish we could provide more.
Yeah, thank you for talking more about that. I think it is such an important project. And like, yeah, I think what you're describing is so common in like Jewish spiritual startups, whether that be like ones who are providing like an object, a ritual object like tzitzit, or like actual rituals. It's, yeah, it feels very impossible to find funding for these things that are so important, which is then, yeah, just so upsetting, because then those things don't exist because it's not sustainable, and we can't do that work without being paid for these things because we live in capitalism. It would be great if we could, but we can't. And there is like so much money that is raised in the Jewish community that just like goes to Israel instead of like bolstering our own spiritual ritual practices. Yeah, which just feels like such a sad disservice to like our practice. A little birdie that we talked to recently, Shell, who, if you haven't listened to our episode with Shell, you should go listen to that now, told us that you've done some work in the Hudson Valley around Jewish psychedelics, which I know you mentioned like much earlier in our time together. On a personal level, this is a topic that I find really fascinating. Like, I am very into like mycelium and all of those like amazing nature connections, and then also as like a therapist, all the different therapeutic practices that happen with psychedelics. And so the idea that there could be like a Jewish element to that was like, I was in immediately. I was like, okay, I can't wait to hear about this. Can you share more, like, yeah, what is Jewish psychedelics? What does that consist of? What are the connections happening? Anything you can share with us?
I would love to talk about this. I am deep in Jewish psychedelics. I love that this world exists, and it's also complex, just like Jewish community is. So I'll tell you the most recent and vibrant aspect of this work. There are two plants that some people hypothesize are like Jewish ancestral medicine. Whether or not that's the case, these plants are Syrian rue and acacia, both native to the Middle East. And acacia shows up in the Torah many times. It's the wood that's made to build the ark, the Mishkan. It's specifically articulated in Exodus that acacia is the wood, and in the bark of acacia is DMT, and then rue has the component that helps open up and make that DMT and that God experience available. And we're creating Jewish containers for taking this medicine. This medicine has a similar impact to the level of ayahuasca, so it's strong. Yeah. And it's the kind of container that is done in a very intentional context. It's not recreational. It's the impact is such that, you know, you have your eyes closed, you're deep in a hallucinatory space, and we create total Jewish tradition around it. So in my experiences with this medicine, we create a Shabbaton. We spend Shabbos together first. So, you know, it's interesting because I've heard it said like 90 or 80% of the medicine experience is the container itself. Only 10 or 20% is the actual plant medicine. So it's creating ceremony around the experience of engaging with the plants and bringing a consciousness of how we do that in a Jewish way. And then there's an aspect of fasting, which actually I engaged with the medicine this Yom Kippur, and it was very powerful because you're going through a fast and you're going through this period of atonement. And then in the space itself of taking the medicine, there's, you know, brachas that you say, and then there's Jewish music. So we work with Jewish musicians and we're bringing that forth in Jewish prayer. And it's really powerful when I think, like, from my perspective, like what plant consciousness brings is like a sense of divinity. Like it's just completely rooted in the space of the divine, Hashem, however you want to name it. And when you situate it within Jewish ritual and Jewish community, then it has this level of really bringing us in close encounter with ancestors and with grief and with trajectories of our own histories that these plant medicines do open up for people. So it's really rich and powerful. And the way that I even came into it is, I don't even know, like 15 years ago when I first took ayahuasca, I went into it as totally non-Jewish context, had no idea that my experience was going to be totally Jewish. Like just the music reminded me of being in shul. It was like prayer, sorrowful, joyful, the kind of movement of that. I had moments where I was in like pre-verbal memories of like looking at the stained glass through the architecture of my shul, like the presence of my grandfather being there the whole time. And he was a very prayerful, pious man. These aspects of connection that I just absolutely could not have predicted. And so for people who go deep into medicine work, it's bringing up memories that are very strong in how you grew up, but also like memories that might not even be your own. And definitely, working in a therapeutic context for people who've experienced a lot of trauma, those shadow selves come through. I think like what's really fascinating is there's so many different Jewish communities engaging with medicine. Like I described rue and acacia as this very particular medicine container, which I think part of our relationship to that plant medicine is that there isn't a recorded history with those plants. And so we can create our own rituals around it as opposed to appropriating or sitting with others' cultures. And so much as engagement with other cultures are like a beautiful thing, I have just found that when I'm in a non-Jewish context and I'm having a lot of Jewish feelings, it's challenging. And I've actually confronted very weird dynamics in that way. So the safety of the container. Meanwhile, there's, whole Hasidic communities that are engaging with these medicines. It's like a lot of different groups looking for healing. Now, I want to say something that's related to this podcast in terms of Zionism and anti-Zionism, because I was a part of this WhatsApp chat that was like the Jewish psychedelic chat. And after October 7th, it got so Zionist and so it was full of like violence, how I interpreted of violence. And I was like really confused because I just came with this naive idea that if you're engaging with psychedelics, you're looking towards the light, like you have some notion, even if it's like infused with a lot of new age bullshit, you still like believe in some idea of peace and you would not be advocating for violence. I mean, boy, was I wrong. And there was a lot of doxing and public shaming, including of me in that chat. And so a close friend of mine who's Israeli, who's also like a therapist and does medicine assisted therapy, we started a new chat. And it's funny that I'm talking about it now, but I think it should be known because that's like even within the Jewish psychedelic space, there's this fracture. Now, it's interesting because there's a lot of psychedelic work being done in Israel. And even, even the work around like there was research done around the survivors of the Nova Festival and whether they were taking acid or MDMA at the time of the Hamas attack, what level of trauma were they carrying? I mean, it's wild that like the University of Haifa like published this research, and it turned out that if they were doing MDMA, they had more capacity to like process the trauma. And I'm naming this because I know that there's work being done now to like support people in Israel who are experiencing a lot of trauma. And like in my mind, like when I'm sitting in these Jewish spaces doing psychedelic work, like it is oriented towards doing the healing beyond you know, that like, I get that there's healing within the Jewish community that needs to take place, and we have to do it in service of healing and ending harm in all of the ways that it manifests in the Jewish state. And I guess, like, to me, that's like, if it's the challenge that even in a psychedelic space, even in a therapeutic space, that there's still coming up this resistance that's situated in the narratives of violence, you know, that nationalism supports. And it's like, how do you begin to break those boundaries? And that, I mean, then you realize how deeply rooted this violence is, and that we've just justified, and that there are grievable lives and there are ungrievable lives. And the dehumanization is at a scale that and that's the question I have around, like, okay, so there's soldiers who are doing like psychedelic assisted therapy. Like, okay, they're carrying all those traumas. Like, my heart goes out to them. I'm not, individuals are part of this system and part of this machine. And like, systemically, how do we actually spread that healing? I'm going to say one more thing about this, connected to this. This is really cool. So I'm a part of this group called Cosmic Camels, and it was started by Israeli and Palestinian like peace activists. And then they moved, I think their first gathering was in the Sinai, and then they started a Burning Man camp called Cosmic Camels. And it's made up of Palestinians, Israelis, Jews in the diaspora, and other people from the Swana region. And we all come together and like, look, I would have never gone to Burning Man in the past, but a friend of mine was like, you have to be a part of this community. It's really unique. And here's like the fascinating part is like sitting together and living together and tripping together. It's unbelievable the ways in which we can tune into each other's traumas, each other's histories, acknowledging the complexities that we're all carrying in a space in the context of these festivals where there's like all this mishigas, all of this craziness going on, but we're like there to be in a shared cultural space that like is also tapping into joy and dance and music. And this past year, we totally broke apart because our camels from 2023, a number of them were from Gaza. And yeah, a number of them like lost hundreds of family and homes destroyed, and just like such a sense of pain and fracture in our community. And yet we are continuing to be in conversation, and it is so dynamic. And also it's put me in touch with these healing communities that exist in Palestine and Israel. I know it's hard to believe because people are so removed from this approach to thinking about being in community. And, you know, there's been ayahuasca ceremonies for Israelis and Palestinians sitting together, and it's done with so much intention. And one of our members helped facilitate those. He's Palestinian. And a lot of the people involved in this group like lead different organizations and do different forms of activism, or are like working as therapists doing psychedelic assisted therapy. And I think that like when there feels like there's so few tools to access in the face of so much destruction and violence, like people, no matter where you're at in your relationship to psychedelics, like there is consciousness in these plants, and it is about grounding us in the divine. That's really what I feel and experience. And so I'm not someone who speaks frivolously about kind of new age concepts. Like you can't, like I can't tell you my astrology. People take that very seriously. So my point is, take psychedelics seriously.
Yeah, thank you. There's so many parts of that are so fascinating. And yeah, I do think that there is still like such a stigma about psychedelics and about like using psychedelics in healing ways, but there's so much evidence of like the healing power of psychedelics, like both in like a therapeutic scientific sense, and also like that doesn't need to be the grounding for something to be legitimate. And there's plenty of just like indigenous wisdom and experience with, and when I say indigenous, I mean from like indigenous cultures all over the world, like experience with using plant medicine for healing and for processing and for transformation. And so, yeah, I appreciate you bringing Judaism into that conversation and that picture, because for me, it feels like a really special tie-in. And I do think that it is such like a divine and spiritual experience to engage with different kinds of plant medicine, that it makes sense that it would like engage with our religious or spiritual practices in those ways. Oh, well, kind of perfect. Our next question is about spiritual practices and spiritual practices that you use to bolster yourself in this work that you're doing. So much of the work that you've described during our conversation is grounded in like a lot of grief and a lot of trauma and a lot of pain and joy and life, like a lot of dichotomies. And just doing work, I think, in the Jewish community in general can be draining and hard and challenging. Are there any spiritual practices that you use to bolster yourself while you do this work?
Many, many, many. Definitely prayer has come in more strongly than ever in my life. So just like waking up, morning prayer, Madani, putting a lot of intention and care into how I bring my energy into the world. I meditate, I'm an Ashtanga yogi, and being in community. Really, like that's the most sacred part, and really sitting with people, listening to people, being able to share, being vulnerable. I think also dance has been a spiritual practice for me, and I've brought it into my art practice. And of course, my art practice itself is a form of spirituality. And I think, as I've said, my engagement with the plants. I've also do a Talmud study, weekly Talmud study. There's a European-based group that I'm a part of, Zekolel, that's wonderful. And I'm constantly amazed what Jewish study and Chivruta like does to open up like a sense of hope and spirit. Somehow or another, at this point in my life, Judaism is infusing many, many aspects. And I think because I orient around the spiritual, it's just kind of natural that all of these elements have a spiritual essence to them.
That's so beautiful. And like getting me excited about what else might be percolating in your mind, and as far as spiritual practices or otherwise. And we're so grateful that we got, like, I feel very special that we got like this special sneak peek of the Rabbi Aaron Shmuel Tamares project that is ongoing. Are there any other upcoming projects or things that people should be looking forward to from you?
The Sensitive Rebbe is the name of the project, and this is a big one. And this one is like, I can tell is going to be long term. And one aspect of it is like helping organize itinerary for Ashkenazi Jews to make healing pilgrimages to Poland. But this ongoing Dybbuk project, I'm now bringing it more to North America, and I'm offering my Dybbuk workshop, which I offered at Der Niester in LA, this really cool Yiddish center in downtown LA. And it's basically bringing a lot of the aspects that I spoke about earlier of the Dybbuk project, of storytelling, of connecting to ancestors, of connecting to Yiddish dance movement, and doing it in a very communal setting. So for me, I'm very curious how I can continue to lead these workshops and also show the videos of the performances, because I've been filming them and we're editing videos for them. And yeah, I think like I'm feeling, even though I'm rooting my work in Europe right now, I'm feeling every time I come back to the States, this sense of people being hungry for ways to engage with Judaism that are about spirit, that are politically aligned, but not not only around the political dimension. And as much as that is important, I think that we have to nourish ourselves in these spiritual and cultural and imaginative ways. Otherwise we'll be too depleted to do the other work that we have to do. So my hope is that I can offer that.
Well, we remain very excited for all of these projects to come and what you've already been working on. Also, I looked up the Arava Festival and it looks amazing. I feel like there's always so much there's so many cool things happening in California. We need some of it on the East Coast. This is always the hardest question for some, the easiest question for others. But as we come to a close with our time together, if you could leave our listeners with one message, what would it be?
Trust that whatever sensibility you have around your ancestry as a Jew, that it is real and it wants to be expressed, and it wants to be expressed in a way that is centering the divine and rooted in justice. And yeah, this is the message that I have, and it's the work that I'm grounding myself in on a daily basis, because I think it's really hard right now to be Jewish. Baruch Hashem, also, like, we're in a totally safe place. Our bodies are not in harm, and there are people who are dealing with the threat of death and destruction every minute. So I say that carrying that awareness and knowing that there is something alive in us that can come forth, that can bring a more just world into being.
Thank you. I think that's that's beautiful and important. And this whole conversation has been beautiful and important. And we're so appreciative that you were down to talk with us and that you took time out of your day and travels all over the world to be here with us and go in depth in some of these conversations that can sometimes be difficult to have and are not always had out in the light. So just feeling very appreciative and of you and your time and your work in the Jewish community.
Thank you so much. It's like I love getting to talk. It's also kind of vulnerable when you know that it's going to be public. But I think I need to put myself out there more, not just like through my art practice, but in my voice. So I really, really appreciate this.
Thank you so much. If you enjoyed this episode, Julie is hosting an online workshop on December 8th. The registration link and all the information are in the show notes. This will be an online workshop exploring ancestral folktales about the Dybbuk and Jewish rituals of exorcism. Drawing from Julie's extensive research and artistic practice, Weitz will share stories, images, and videos that illuminate the cultural and spiritual significance of the Dybbuk. Participants will also explore simple, accessible movement techniques inspired by Yiddish dance, fostering embodied connections to their ancestors. The workshop incorporates insights from Holy Names for Our Dybbuk, Weitz's performance art project that reimagines Dybbuk exorcism as a movement-based ritual at sites of Jewish memory in Poland. Conducted in English, this workshop welcomes participants of all backgrounds and requires no prior experience. Come dressed comfortably and ready to engage in storytelling, movement, and learning. Thanks for listening to Making Mentions. As an explicitly anti-Zionist grassroots org, we don't receive any institutional funding or support. Please consider supporting our work by funding us. You can find the donation link on our website, makingmentions.com.
You can follow us on Instagram at Making Menches. We host monthly Shabbats both in person and online, so make sure to sign up for our newsletter, which is on our website, to get updates.
Making Menches, the podcast, is produced by Alana Lipkin and Jesse Sander. Intro music is by Nate Sander. Editing by Jesse